The morning of March 15th started like any other Wednesday in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio reviewed his docket, the usual collection of traffic violations, parking disputes, and minor infractions that form the daily rhythm of municipal justice. Outside, early spring sunshine filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. But within the hour, this ordinary morning would become the setting for one of the most dramatic confrontations between political privilege and judicial authority ever recorded in an American courtroom. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the courtroom doors opened with deliberate force. Victoria Romano, known to everyone as Vicki, swept into the room with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to deference. At 45, she carried herself with the polished confidence that comes from 15 years as the wife of Providence Mayor Anthony Romano. Everything about her entrance was calculated. Her designer suit spoke of wealth and status. Her jewelry caught the light with obvious intention. Her expression communicated a clear message. She wasn't here to participate in the judicial process. She was here to remind everyone present of who she was and why the normal rules shouldn't apply to her. Vicki Romano had received a citation 3 weeks earlier for parking in a fire lane, outside an exclusive waterfront restaurant, during a political fundraiser. The violation occurred during a $1,000 per plate dinner for her husband's re-election campaign. The fine was standard, $200 plus court costs. But Vicki had no intention of paying. She was here because she believed her status as the mayor's wife placed her above the petty enforcement mechanisms that governed ordinary citizens. What she didn't understand was that she was about to confront a judge who had spent 35 years maintaining absolute independence from political pressure. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his paperwork with the calm, measured gaze of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior in his courtroom. At 76, he had presided over thousands of cases and worked with 12 different mayors. He understood the delicate balance between political power and judicial independence better than perhaps anyone in Rhode Island. "Victoria Romano," the court clerk announced, reading from the docket. Vicki stepped forward, her impatience visible in every gesture. She checked her expensive watch, a subtle but clear signal that she considered this proceeding beneath her valuable time. "Mrs. Romano," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying the measured authority of decades on the bench. "You're charged with parking in a designated fire lane in violation of City Ordinance 15208. This violation occurred on March the 2nd at 7:45 p.m. outside the waterfront restaurant. How do you plead?" What happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your Honor," Vicki said, her voice dripping with barely concealed condescension, "I am pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the practical realities of municipal governance and the operational necessities of political leadership." The courtroom went quiet. Experienced court watchers recognized the danger in what had just occurred. Vicki Romano had just attempted to lecture Judge Caprio about how government works. Judge Caprio set down his pen. Never a positive sign for defendants who think they can educate him about municipal law. "Mrs. Romano," he said evenly, "were you attending a municipal function or conducting official city business at the time of this violation?" "Your Honor, I was attending a political fundraiser for my husband's re-election campaign. As the mayor's wife, my attendance at such events is essential for effective municipal leadership and community engagement." The implications were staggering. Vicki had just claimed that her husband's political campaign activities should exempt her from fire safety regulations, laws designed to protect public safety in emergency situations. "Mrs. Romano, do you hold any elected office or official position with the City of Providence?" Vicki's irritation became visible. She clearly hadn't expected to be pressed on specifics about her actual authority. "Your Honor, as the mayor's wife, I serve in an unofficial but vital capacity, supporting municipal governance and representing the city at important community events. Judge Caprio's expression remained neutral, but veterans of his courtroom recognized the signs. He was about to deliver a lesson in civics. Mrs. Romano, can you cite the specific municipal code or state statute that exempts mayors' spouses from fire safety regulations? Vicki paused, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning. Your Honor, I think you're missing the larger picture of how municipal leadership actually functions in practice. The silence that followed was profound. Vicki Romano had just suggested that Judge Frank Caprio, a man with 45 years of experience in municipal law, didn't understand how city government works. But Vicki wasn't finished making what would prove to be the biggest mistake of her political life. Your Honor, she continued, her tone taking on the quality of someone explaining obvious facts to a person who clearly doesn't grasp them. I've been involved in Providence politics for 15 years as the mayor's wife. I think I understand how municipal authority and civic leadership work better than someone who sits in a courtroom all day dealing with minor infractions. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the gallery. Vicki had just insulted Judge Caprio's understanding of municipal governance and suggested that political social status trumps judicial authority. What came next was even more explosive. Vicki looked directly at Judge Caprio with undisguised political arrogance. Your Honor, I think you need to consider the practical implications of this situation. My husband is the mayor of this city. He appoints members to various municipal boards and commissions. The city's budget affects court funding. I suggest you think carefully about how you handle this case. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Vicki Romano had just threatened a sitting judge with political retaliation. She had crossed a line that would not only destroy her own reputation, but potentially end her husband's political career. Judge Caprio slowly stood up from his bench, an unprecedented gesture that signaled something monumental was about to occur. He removed his glasses with deliberate precision and looked directly at Vicki with the calm, measured expression of someone about to deliver an education in constitutional law. Mrs. Romano, he said, his voice remaining perfectly controlled, but carrying the full weight of judicial independence. Did you just threaten this court with political retaliation? Vicki, still emboldened by what she mistook for judicial uncertainty, doubled down. Your Honor, I'm simply pointing out the realities of how municipal governance operates. Political leaders have responsibilities and relationships that extend beyond individual court cases. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, as if carefully documenting each word for future reference. I see. Mrs. Romano, since you've questioned my understanding of municipal authority, let me share some information with you about how our system of government actually works. He moved to the constitutional law books on his desk. Mrs. Romano, you mentioned that your husband appoints people to municipal boards. Are you familiar with the constitutional principle of separation of powers and judicial independence? Vicki hesitated, sensing she was walking into a constitutional ambush. Your Honor, I understand that political leadership requires cooperation between different branches of government. That's not what I asked, Mrs. Romano. Are you familiar with the constitutional requirement that the judicial branch remain independent from political pressure and intimidation? Vicki's confident demeanor began to crack as she realized she was being systematically outmatched by someone who understood constitutional law far better than she understood political influence. Your Honor, I never intended to threaten anyone. Mrs. Romano, Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice gaining authority. Threatening a judge with political retaliation is not just inappropriate. It's potentially criminal. It's called judicial intimidation, and it's a felony under Rhode Island state law. The arrogance drained from Vicki's face as she realized she may have just committed a serious crime in open court, with every word being recorded. Furthermore, Mrs. Romano, you suggested that I don't understand municipal governance. Let me share my qualifications. I've been practicing municipal law for 45 years. I've served on this bench for 35 years. I've worked with 12 different mayors, including your husband. I understand municipal authority better than politicians who think their spouse's election makes them experts on government. But Judge Caprio was just getting started. What he revealed next would completely destroy Vicki's case and expose the full scope of her political corruption. He pulled out a thick file from his desk. Mrs. Romano, since you've threatened this court and claimed political authority, I took the liberty of reviewing your parking and traffic violation history. Vicki's face went completely pale. She clearly hadn't expected her driving record to be scrutinized. According to city records, you've received 11 parking violations in the past 2 years. How many of those tickets did you pay, Mrs. Romano? The courtroom was dead silent as Vicki realized the scope of her miscalculation. Your Honor, I'm not sure of the exact number. I'll help you with the exact number, Mrs. Romano. You paid 0. According to these records, you've ignored 11 municipal citations, accumulating $2,200 in unpaid fines and penalties. Vicki tried to speak, but Judge Caprio continued with devastating precision. Furthermore, Mrs. Romano, city parking enforcement has documented 17 different occasions where you've used your political status to avoid citations, including twice where you told parking officers, and I quote, "Do you know who my husband is? This ticket will disappear." Vicki's political arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine terror as her pattern of corruption was exposed in open court. Your Honor, those incidents were misunderstandings. Mrs. Romano, threatening parking officers with political retaliation isn't a misunderstanding. It's abuse of political power. And now, you've threatened a sitting judge with the same corrupt tactics. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger, more authoritative. You suggested that your husband's position as mayor gives you special privileges. You threatened this court with political consequences. You've demonstrated a pattern of using political intimidation to avoid legal accountability. What he announced next would shock everyone in the courtroom. Mrs. Romano, not only am I finding you guilty of the fire lane violation and imposing the full $200 fine plus court costs, but I'm also holding you in contempt of court for threatening judicial independence. Vicki's mouth opened in shock, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, Mrs. Romano, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office for investigation of judicial intimidation, political corruption, and abuse of public trust. The courtroom buzzed with shock as Vicki realized the implications for her husband's political career. But most importantly, Judge Caprio continued, standing at his full judicial authority, I'm referring this matter to the Providence City Council Ethics Committee and recommending a full investigation into Mayor Romano's administration regarding the systematic abuse of political position by family members. Vicki looked like she was about to faint as the full weight of her political destruction became apparent. Your Honor, you can't destroy my husband's career because of a parking ticket. Mrs. Romano, I'm not destroying your husband's career. You destroyed your husband's career the moment you decided to threaten a sitting judge, while demonstrating a pattern of political corruption that reflects directly on his administration. Judge Caprio walked closer to the defendant's stand, his constitutional authority on full display. Mrs. Romano, let me share something with you about political power and judicial independence. I've served under 12 mayors in my 35 years on this bench. I've seen political families come and go. I've watched politicians who thought they were untouchable learn that in this courtroom, The Constitution matters more than campaign contributions. His voice took on the tone of a civics professor addressing a failing student. Your husband holds office at the pleasure of the voters, not at the pleasure of this court. But when political families use intimidation, threats, and corruption to avoid legal accountability, they undermine the very democratic system that gave them power in the first place. Vicki stood frozen, her earlier swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could threaten a judge with your husband's political position. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why political corruption is dangerous to democracy and why judicial independence is essential to constitutional government. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, preparing to deliver his final judgment. A mayor's wife who threatens judges is part of a political family that threatens citizens. A politician whose spouse believes laws don't apply to them is a politician who believes democracy exists to serve their personal interests rather than the public good. He picked up his gavel. Mrs. Romano, your fine for the fire lane violation is $200. Your contempt of court citation carries an additional $500 penalty and 40 hours of community service. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to the Attorney General, the Ethics Committee, and the voters why a sitting judge found your conduct to be corrupt and threatening to democratic governance. Vicki's voice was barely a whisper. Your Honor, please. I'm not finished, Mrs. Romano. You mentioned that your husband's position affects court funding and municipal appointments. Let me tell you what affects judicial independence, the Constitution, the rule of law, and the principle that no political position grants immunity from legal accountability. Judge Caprio looked out at the packed courtroom, including several political reporters who had come to cover what they thought would be a routine traffic case. Let this be a lesson to every political family watching. Your elected office is a privilege granted by the people, not a license to threaten judges, ignore laws, or corrupt the very system that gave you power. When political families believe they're above the law, democracy itself is in danger. He looked back at Vicki, who stood with her head bowed in complete humiliation. Mrs. Romano, I strongly recommend that you and your husband spend some time reflecting on the difference between public service and personal privilege, between political leadership and political corruption, and between representing the people and exploiting them. Judge Caprio raised his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. As the courtroom emptied, Vicki stood alone at the defendant table, staring down at the citation that had just cost her $700 and potentially her husband's political career. The political privilege that had protected her for 15 years had been systematically dismantled by a 76-year-old judge who understood that democracy only works when everyone follows the same laws. Political reporter Sarah Chen, who had witnessed the entire proceeding, told Channel 12 News, I've covered Providence politics for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what just happened. A sitting judge just documented a pattern of political corruption by the mayor's family in open court. Within hours, the Rhode Island Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the Romano administration. The Providence City Council called an emergency ethics hearing. 3 major local newspapers' editorial boards called for Mayor Romano's resignation. By evening, Mayor Anthony Romano held a press conference. Standing beside his wife, he announced that he would not seek re-election and would cooperate fully with all investigations. My wife's conduct in court today does not represent the values of public service or the respect for law that should characterize political leadership, he said. The Romano political dynasty, built over 15 years, collapsed in a single morning because a mayor's wife thought she could threaten a judge. 6 months later, the Attorney General's investigation concluded that the Romano administration had created a culture of political privilege and legal exemption that extended far beyond parking tickets. Mayor Romano completed his term, but was effectively a political pariah, with his party refusing to support him for any future office. Years later, political science students would study the Romano case as an example of how quickly political careers can be destroyed when families mistake elected office for legal immunity. Professor Janet Walsh at Brown University regularly tells her students, Judge Caprio didn't end Mayor Romano's career to make a political point. He ended it to protect democracy from political families who think they're above the law. The video of that Wednesday morning became one of the most watched political accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Political science programs around the world used it as training material about the importance of judicial independence and the dangers of political corruption. For those who knew Judge Caprio personally, it was simply another example of what made him exceptional: the ability to defend constitutional principles against political pressure, to educate through justice, and to transform political arrogance into democratic accountability. He proved that judicial independence isn't just a legal principle. It's the foundation that prevents democracy from becoming a system where political families rule rather than serve. In an era when political corruption often goes unchecked, Judge Frank Caprio demonstrated that constitutional government works when judges refuse to be intimidated, when courts remain independent of political pressure, and when everyone, including mayors' wives, learns that threatening judges is the fastest way to destroy everything political families have worked to build.